No, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Environmental Studies program for hosting. I haven't been back at Tufts very often because, as you'll see, I've been busy. This book project has taken a good 5 years of my life, a wonderful 5 years of my life. It was a one-year fellowship, so any academics here know how that goes. But I'm really happy with how it came out. I'm really happy to be back talking about it at Tufts, where I spent a good 18 years housed at the Global Development and Environment Institute and did a lot of the foundational research that fed into what I'll talk about today. I also always like to thank the New Press for producing such a pretty book. Any academics who've written a book or anyone else who's written a book knows that it's not a guarantee that the book that's going to come out of the publisher is one that you're actually really happy to see. I'm really happy to see it. And I ended up very happy with the title, Eating Tomorrow, too, which actually has its own funny origin story. It was surprisingly hard to come up with a working title for this book. People who've written books might understand that problem. And I didn't really have a good working title when 4 years ago now I asked to meet with Frances Moore-Lappé, who's now my colleague at the Small Planet Institute. She's the author of Diet for a Small Planet, and now 19 other books. So I figured she was a good person to talk to about a book proposal. She met me for lunch. We talked about the book. She gave me great advice on a first book proposal, advice which made the book much better in ways that if you read the book, I'll get credit for that, but she should get some of the credit for it. And then we brainstormed titles, and we didn't come up with anything we liked at lunch. And we said goodbye, and I'm walking home, and my cell phone rings, and it's Frankie. And I said, "Oh, hi, Frankie." And she said, "Hey, Tim, what about Eating Tomorrow?" And I'm not lying. I said, "Well, Frankie, I really enjoyed our lunch. I could do it tomorrow again, I guess." And she said, "No, your book, your title of your book, Eating Tomorrow." And so that is where Eating Tomorrow was born. It's grown on me as as I worked on the book, and as particularly as the climate crisis asserted itself more and more forcefully everywhere I went. The challenge of eating tomorrow obviously comes up, and the double meaning of that term is really, I think, captures what I'm trying to say in this book and what I found in the research. That basically that humanity faces a continuing challenge to ensure everyone can eat today, and we're doing a terrible job of that with about 800 million people in extreme hunger every year. And climate change makes the challenge of feeding people tomorrow all the more daunting. But the way we're producing our food on chemical-intensive industrial-scale farms is quite literally devouring the natural resource base, soil, water, seeds, climate, on which future food production depends. By continuing and actually expanding and exporting this industrial model of agriculture to places like Africa, we are eating our collective tomorrows, undermining our capacity to feed ourselves in the future. I wrote this book really because with 30 years in this field, I wanted to understand why policymakers were ignoring the low-cost solutions all around them, the sustainable low-cost solutions offered by the family farmers in their own communities, particularly in developing countries, and why instead they're pushing these expensive policies that are not doing a great job of making sure people can eat today and are undermining their ability to eat tomorrow. The subtitle of the book, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, kind of summarizes my diagnosis and conclusion. There is a battle for the future of food. There are actually multiple battles for the future of food, and that's really good news. People are fighting back all over the world, trying to establish a more sustainable food system. But agribusiness firms have largely hijacked the policy agenda in most of the countries I visited, and are engineering those policies to their benefit, not the benefit of either the environment or small-scale farmers. all of this work is in some way inspired by and answers the perennial question asked overwhelmingly in the United States: how will we feed the world, right? Food price spikes 10 years ago raised alarms about, oh, are we finally hitting that Malthusian moment when the natural resource base is exhausted and we don't have the natural resources to feed a growing population. That caused food riots in many countries and raised alarms. The question of how we feed the world is an important question. I say it's an important question with a lot of really, really bad answers. Most of those bad answers focus on producing more food commodities, that we're going to feed the hungry by producing more food commodities. And that answer is as wrong today as it was 50 years ago when Francis Moore Lappé wrote Diet for a Small Planet and showed that hunger was not the product of a scarcity of food. It was a product of a scarcity of power over food-producing resources and over income. It is as wrong today as proven by the statistics, a Reuters news report that said that we are currently experiencing a global grain glut in the world. Anybody who comes from farm country knows that farm prices are really low, and that's because we're overproducing in the United States, not just the United States. All of these industrial economies are producing, our industrial agriculture systems are overproducing, and grain is rotting outside of silos. And yet, in that same time, in the last 3 years, there's been an increase in the number of hungry people recorded by the FAO. Hunger increasing amid rising food surpluses. Why do we keep getting it so wrong, thinking that growing more food in that way is going to feed the people who are hungry? I argue in the book that one of the reasons we get it so wrong is because the question itself, how will we feed the world, is fundamentally flawed. It's actually deeply arrogant when you think about it. So how will we feed the world? We know who we mean, right? When we say we, we mean the global north, the industrialized countries, those with the high-yield, chemical-intensive agriculture that produce such vast quantities of commodities. Yet nothing could be further from the truth that that's who's feeding the world. 70% of the food consumed in developing countries where hunger is the greatest is grown in those countries. And the majority of that is grown by small-scale farmers in those countries. We're not feeding the world, they're feeding themselves largely, and struggling to do it. There's also no abstract world out there waiting to be fed, which is the other part of that question that I find arrogant. It's like, how do we feed the world? Like, they're just waiting for us to feed them. The majority of the hungry in developing countries are in agricultural communities and make their living off of farming, at least partly. Think about that. They're not passively waiting to be fed. They're struggling year to year, day to day, to try to feed their families on limited resources with poor soils and limited support from government. They're not passively waiting to be fed. They're feeding themselves. But that's the ultimate paradox, right, is food producers being among the world's largest group of hungry people. The obvious answer to that question, to that challenge, is to put food producers in a better position to grow more food, right? But what I saw in country after country researching this book is that policymakers are doing no such thing. And why? I argue in the book that it's because doing so would cut into agribusiness profits, and agribusiness is largely running the show. Eating Tomorrow is a first-person narrative account. I try to take the reader along with me as I travel around the world trying to figure out what's going on and why policymakers are doing what they're doing and what the challenges are and how they're playing out. It's filled with stories and characters. It does not have one single graph or table. As a recovering economist, that's step 4 in the recovery process. Step 5 is actually no PowerPoint, but I don't tell my sponsors that I'm violating that step. I didn't include any graphs or tables in the PowerPoint, though, so just photos, so you'll be happier about that. But so what I want to do here is just share some of what you'll find in Eating Tomorrow. I can't cover it all. I won't talk so much about Mexico or India, more about the US and Southern Africa. And that's partly because Africa is where the battle for the future of food is really the most urgent. It's where hunger is the most severe. It's where soils are the most degraded, farming's the least productive. It's also where climate change is already having the most severe impact and is projected to have the most severe impact in the world. It's also where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and donor governments are aggressively exporting the industrial model of agriculture. The Green Revolution for Africa, you may have heard of it, is a well-funded attempt to increase farm production by promoting commercial seeds and chemical fertilizers in developing countries in Africa. Its model is the first Green Revolution. People have heard of the first Green Revolution? Yeah? Yes and no? It was an attempt to develop new seed varieties that would produce high yields when used with inorganic fertilizers, and it was promoted widely and credited with increasing food production in India, parts of Latin America, but it bypassed Africa for a whole variety of reasons. The argument now is that we have better technology, better seed technology, and Africa can have a green revolution designed just for its specific conditions, and that's what the Alliance for Green Revolution is about. Its main vehicle is that African governments are putting scarce public funds, sometimes as much as 60% of their agricultural budgets, into subsidies for commercial seeds and chemical fertilizers. I start the book with the Malawi miracle. It's called a miracle because 13 years ago, the Malawian government ignored World Bank and International Monetary Fund advice, which was bold at the time. The advice was never subsidize anything. They said, forget it, we've had 3 years in the last 5 of poor crops, of being on the international dole for food aid. We want to grow more of our own food. We're going to subsidize. And they gave coupons for discounted seed and fertilizer to small-scale farmers to grow more corn, the main staple crop in the country. And the thing about that is, it worked. It's called a miracle because they dramatically increased corn production in the country. In the first couple of years, they doubled and then tripled corn production of the main staple crop in the country. So they ignored the IMF and the World Bank. They stood up for themselves. They put a ton of money into giving coupons to smallholders so they could grow more corn. And it worked. The problem is, and this is sort of when I entered the picture, that program was largely unraveling. And in ways that many could have predicted, it would unravel. Because in the long run, synthetic fertilizer alone does nothing for the long-term fertility of the soil, right? It adds fertility for a crop to grow, nutrients the crop needs to grow, but it doesn't fertilize the soil. And over the long run, planted in monocultures of corn year after year after year, which of course farmers were growing more of because that's the seeds that were subsidized. The government was giving out cheap seeds. So more corn was being grown. Monocultures doused with fertilizer does not make for growing soil fertility. In fact, pouring fertilizer onto monocrop corn, I argue, is a little like putting trout in a trout pond at the beginning of the spring. Sure, fishermen can go and pull some trout out of that pond later in the summer, but the pond isn't any more capable of sustaining life than it was before. And the land, you can get some corn out of the ground if you put enough fertilizer in it, even really bad land, but it's not going to make the land more fertile. In fact, it makes the land over time more acidic and less fertile. Yields flatten out, and what that means is that farmers need more and more fertilizer to get the same production. And so you start to see a decline in productivity. And that's what I saw in Malawi starting in 2013. The yields plateau, and farmers need more and more fertilizer. But of course, the government can't afford to subsidize an unlimited quantity, and fertilizer is really expensive, so farmers can't afford to buy it. Even if they're getting increased production, they still can't afford it. So yields have started to decline. What's perhaps more striking is that despite this rise in corn production, Malawi showed scarcely any evidence at all of a reduction in rural hunger. That gets back to that initial paradox, right? Is the answer to hunger growing more food? Not necessarily. It's maybe a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. Rural poverty is still over 50%, undernourishment 20%. Underweight children was a higher level than before the subsidy program began, which is striking, and child stunting at 42%. This is a warning sign for the Green Revolution of Africa, because this was considered one of its success stories. Now, what I saw everywhere I went were alternatives to this approach. There's enterprising farm groups all over Southern Africa, who I met. In Malawi, the Malawi Farmer-to-Farmer Agroecology Project in central Malawi and now southern Malawi had purified and improved a local variety, meaning a non-commercial variety of orange corn, very high in vitamin A, very much needed nutritionally in southern Africa and much of the developing world. Low vitamin A can cause blindness among children and a host of other diseases. It's the reason genetically modified crops for things like golden rice are being invented, is to try to address this problem of vitamin A deficiency. Here they found a local variety that was high in vitamin A, that grew well, that farmers liked, and they started improving it and reproducing it and growing it with other crops. So they'd interplant it with other crops so that in an agroecological model that would increase soil fertility and decrease the need for external inputs. What that also did was improve their nutritional diversity, and actually it was really interesting that the origin of the project came from a nutrition program at the University of Malawi, seeing a diet that was way too dependent on corn and a need for greater diet diversity. So they thought, well, let's improve crop diversity and that way we can get more diet diversity. It was wildly successful. They got very high productivity out of this native variety of corn and much greater nutritional diversity and crop diversity. And in the process, by intercropping a variety of crops using composted manure instead of synthetic fertilizer, they saw the fertility of their soil start to increase. So its productivity went up. It also was more resilient to climate change. Why is this so important? It's important because, one, if you're growing a variety of foods, they don't all fail in a drought. So if the corn fails, you've got sweet potato, you've got yucca, whatever. You have other crops. It's also, by improving the soil, it's increasing its moisture retention, its ability to retain moisture. So in a drought, not as much dies. In a flood, you have roots in the ground and the topsoil doesn't just wash away as easily. Two of the biggest problems that I saw and heard about in southern Africa. So I heard farmer after farmer, like this woman here, just singing the praises of this orange corn and this crop. And again, I go in probably somewhat naively thinking, well, so what's the government going to do? Like its subsidy program is failing, is sort of collapsing. They don't have the money to sustain it and it's not producing the results it wants. Do they support a project like this? No, they absolutely don't. Instead, they propose a seed policy that would strengthen the rights of commercial plant breeders over the rights of farmers to save, exchange, and sell seeds like these orange maize seeds. The first draft of the policy was so bad, so extreme, that it actually said that farmers like this couldn't call those kernels of orange corn seeds. They had to call them grain. They didn't meet the criteria for seed because they hadn't been commercially certified. And as one exasperated farmer in that community said to me, how can such a nutritious kind of corn that we've been planting for generations not be a seed? Good question. I was actually arguing with one of the defenders of this seed policy in a in the capital city of Lilongwe in Malawi. And I got exasperated with him, and I said, Tamani, the way this policy reads, it could actually have been written by Monsanto. And he looks down at his shoes, and he looks up, and he says, well, a former Monsanto official was one of the authors of the policy. And that became a little bit of I had very few moments in this project where I broke news. I broke news of that, which actually created a little bit of a furor in Malawi and gave the farmer groups another opportunity to negotiate on that seed policy. And they actually won some serious revisions that took out some of the worst features. And they're now actually working on a farmers' rights policy, which farmers' rights is the catch-all phrase for giving farmers the rights to, guaranteeing farmers the rights to save, exchange, and sell their seeds. But it was striking to see that level of involvement by an interested party. Malawi, Monsanto controlled 50% of the commercial maize seed market in Malawi. They stood to gain by every farmer who couldn't plant their seeds anymore and had to buy on the market. The companies and their philanthropic allies are very aggressively pushing such seed policies all over Africa, and they're determined to, as they see it, open Africa to these kind of commercial seed companies, precisely in their argument to increase productivity. What I saw in Malawi is that it wasn't doing that in a sustainable way, and it was threatening other sources of, more sustainable sources of nutritious food. But they have very much captured most African governments. This is one of the women in Tiolo with the agroecology project who, she's already harvested her corn, and this is the pigeon peas that are left in the cornfield, their second crop, which increased the fertility of her soil and gave her added food. These are the variety of foods that were on display in from the community in a display in the capital city that was visited by, on the right, the president of Malawi as part of a photo opportunity. He came by this community's booth, and farmer Evelyn Jolomole explained the virtues of their orange corn and its nutrition. She reported that when she handed him the bag of orange maize meal, he said, "Oh, is this from Monsanto?" And she shook her head. She said she shook her head and said, actually she saw herself on TV, this is her being interviewed on TV, explaining that no, it was a natural resource that grew in Malawi and that was readily available to help with Malawi's food insecurity problems. One of the other issues that I cover in the book is land grabbing. Land grabbing started in earnest in a big way after to the food price spikes of 2007 and 8, because investment opportunities collapsed with the subprime crisis, with the financial crisis, the stock market tanks, all of this speculative money starts looking for new places to go, and land is a place to go. So there's a boom in land investment in developing countries. That was particularly true. A particular target was Africa, and in Africa, a particular target was Mozambique. I looked at some of this, the land grabbing in the course of the book in Mozambique and Zambia and in Tanzania. What's interesting is that most of the projects I looked at had failed. And with time, we've seen that the vast majority of such projects have failed. It was funny because I was telling this to a friend who's at the Harvard Business School, and he said, well, 3/4 of all startups fail. Why would agriculture be any different? And I think that's actually a good point. Like, why would it be different? It's very speculative investment. And they're going into areas that they don't know, these foreign investors coming in. I went to Mozambique to study the Grand Pro-Savannah project, which was supposed to be the largest land grab in all of Africa. It was Japanese and Brazilian investors trying to build a soybean export platform like Brazil has in the savanna regions of Mozambique. It was a disastrous failure for all kinds of reasons. I mean, you can read the book and get all the reasons that it failed. Among them, though, was that in almost none of these land grabs is the land actually unoccupied. If it's decent land, there's going to be farmers on it. Over generations, they've found the good land. They know where the good land is and they're farming it. And so people are always displaced, almost always displaced by these projects. And in Mozambique, they really resisted that displacement. But what I followed, actually, that I'll tell you a little bit about was this Chinese rice company that came in and took over 50,000 acres of irrigated land in a town called Xai-Xai, about 3 hours up the coast. Mozambique sits on the southeastern coast of Africa, about 3 hours up the coast from the capital city of Maputo. And they were growing rice. They were actually growing rice for the domestic market, which is a rarity for some of these large-scale projects. They're usually growing for export. They're actually usually not growing a food crop, even. They're growing a biofuel crop or something else. But this was a food crop. It was for domestic purposes. But I heard just the abuses that took place in the course of setting up this project. Angelica Moyane was one of the leaders in the community. She said she'd watched as bulldozers with absolutely no notice came and plowed right through her fields. Ripe crops getting plowed right under. She and other farmers protested this. It almost came to violence a number of times. They actually forced the company to withdraw from some of their own lands, but not from all of the lands the company had taken over. They organized legal petitions. They organized protests, like this march in 2014. Wambao is the name of the Chinese rice company. And what's striking is that now, just like so many of these other projects, as I followed this, the project's failing for a whole variety of reasons: lack of financing from China, flood risks along this floodplain of rice farming. And so a lot of the land isn't being farmed at all now, and the farmers sit on the outside looking in. So I asked the farmers what they want, and what they wanted from this, and you'd actually be surprised how rarely anybody ever asks farmers like this what they want. I asked all the time. They are not unclear about it. They said, give all the land back to the communities and let us grow food. That is a very reasonable demand, and actually these local farmers formed this farmers association. This is the photo from their first meeting where they incorporated the Sakane Farmers Association. Sakane means happy in the local language. And they formed a farmers association and petitioned for 750 acres of land for the association to grow more food. That petition is still pending, as I understand it, but they're showing the way forward, right? They're showing, in a way, they're posing a simple question, the same simple question I posed in the book project and posed at the beginning of this talk. If you want to feed the hungry, why not give good land to hungry food producers to let them grow more food and help them do it? They're trying to do that, and they're exploring with groups like the one I met in Malawi how to do it in a sustainable way that improves soil fertility. Zambia is another case where there's, someone else coined the term that it was that there was a country of land-poor farmers in a land-rich country. And it certainly is. The hunger levels are shocking for a country that has so much land and is as fertile as it is. 78% of the rural population is in extreme poverty, and that number hasn't moved in spite of a tripling of corn production, again, the basic staple crop. Again, more food doesn't produce less hunger necessarily. But what the Zambian government is doing, instead of distributing better land and more land to poor farmers, is it's carving out 250,000 acre farm blocks, they're called, and putting in, trying to attract foreign investment to be anchor investments on that land and then expand production around those anchor investments. They have not been very successful getting investors to come in, so a lot of that land is not being farmed. But in with land-poor farmers, think about what that means. 250,000 acres could provide 25,000 farmers, farm families, with 10 acres each. 10 acres each is plenty in Zambia to support your family, to grow a surplus, to sell it on the market, to get cash so that you can invest more in the farm and increase your productivity, to send your kids to school like Wilfred Monga and his daughter. He was worried about his daughter not being able to have enough land when it came time to divide his 12 acres among 5 kids. Girls having access to land is the solution, and other resources and education is the proven solution to population growth. It's how population growth rates come down. It's what agricultural development looks like, has looked like everywhere where it's worked. It could look like that in Zambia. I also followed a land grab in Tanzania, Sun Biofuels producing Jatropha. Anybody ever heard of Jatropha? I know, I hadn't either. Jatropha is an African crop that was deemed to be the biofuel crop of the future because it was native to Africa. It wasn't a food crop, so you weren't taking away food to grow it like we do with our corn for our ethanol program. It grew on quote unquote marginal lands. It turns out it doesn't grow on marginal lands, and of course, investors don't want marginal lands to grow it on. So they took over this 10,000 acre plot, negotiated getting the land from the community, promising roads, schools, wells, clinics, all kinds of social improvements that the community needed. And in 3 years they failed because it turns out Jatropha is a terrible biofuel crop grown in plantation. It doesn't work very well. They failed, and that's when I entered the picture, and they had indeed shut down and subleased the land to another company. The people in the community, when I talked to them, didn't even know that. They didn't even know that the land had been sublet, and none of the land was offered back to the community. Nobody goes back to the community and says, oh gosh, that didn't work. Can we tear up all these terrible plants and give it back to you so you can grow more food? Nobody does that. In Guatemala, Guatemala has the, what would you call it? The blessing and the curse of having such great land that it's great for 3 of the top biofuel crops in the world: palm oil, sugar, and corn. And so it's become a target site in the land rush. And it's been a disaster for local communities. These are indigenous women looking out over the lands that they used to farm before an expansion of sugar and palm oil came in and took their land from them. Land is so scarce that a New York Times reporter found a farmer planting corn in a median strip on a highway because he said it was the only land he could find where he could grow food for his family. It's one of the causes of the outmigration crisis, particularly compounded by drought, which has come with climate change in that part of the world. So climate change is a theme that runs through the book, and I'll wrap up with some talking about that. It was striking to me when I gave a book talk last spring in Iowa that 2 of the places that I had visited for this book, really I focus on 6 places in the book, and 2 of them were underwater from climate change related cyclones that had produced catastrophic flooding. Iowa and Mozambique were both, parts of Iowa were underwater, and parts of Mozambique had been absolutely devastated by Cyclone Idai. Cyclone Idai was unlike anything anyone had ever recorded in southern Africa. The largest storm and the most devastating storm ever to hit that part of Africa. It left an inland sea from 9 days of rampaging in and off the coast and inland and causing heavy rains and then coming back out and going back in. It left 1,000 people dead, untold numbers missing, presumed swept out to sea in the flooding. It hit the 3rd largest city in the country, Beira, so devastated, the largest port and 3rd largest city. left an inland sea from the flooding 100 miles long. And for farmers, it hit them at harvest time. So they hadn't pulled in all the crops from their fields, and they lost them all. That's the only food they have for the year, is what they grow in that season. That same crop gives them their seeds for the next season. When I was there last June, they were desperate for how are we going to get seeds to grow anything in the coming year. But I heard a lot about climate change in Mozambique over the course of the years. Many times I visited a remarkable community of organized farmers, overwhelmingly women, like 90% women, in 7,000 farmers organized in, I think there were 19 farmers associations, all led by women, who were affiliated with the National Peasant Union and had an agroecology project using native seeds and improving their soils through intercropping, like the project I saw in Malawi. They are a bunch of tough women. They told me about the climate roller coaster that they've survived, and they credit their farming with allowing them to survive it. They saw erratic rain start in 2012, 2014, severe drought, temperatures rising. We now call it a climate change, not global warming, but don't kid yourself. The warming is a big deal, and a big deal for farmers. It causes huge problems for crops when temperatures reach and maintain a very high level. They saw temperatures hit 100 degrees, not common in that area of the world. But it was worse than that, because they're lucky enough to have irrigation. So they have irrigation canals running off the Inkomati River, which runs down to the Indian Ocean. Only those dried up because the river dried up. That's bad enough, right? It gets worse. The Indian Ocean swelled about 8 inches higher by sea level rise, flowed back up the Inkomati River, the dried riverbed, and into their irrigation channels, poisoning their land with salt water. They still can't farm 5 years later, some of that land, because of the salt water that infiltrated into and that's a huge international problem. It's a problem in parts of the US too. In 2017, temperatures actually hit 110 degrees there, and farmers said they just watched their corn wilt in the fields. So I would ask them, like, well, how are you guys surviving? And they'd say, yeah, we're doing okay. I was like, how? And they credit, again, this kind of ecological farming, diversified ecological farming, the diversity being the key to the question, right? Is that no one of these disasters has killed everything in their fields. They've found something that that survives, and their land is much better than land in other parts of Mozambique, because they've been improving it for a good 10 years now from these agroecological methods. I mean, their farms actually look beautiful. I came home from seeing Florentina Samuel, that woman there, her farm, and immediately redid my backyard garden in Cambridge because I was ashamed of it. But seriously, they have crops in the ground that hold the soil in place when it floods. They have much richer soil. She held up the soil and crumbled it in her hands and said, we're still suffering, but if this year, next crop is good, we're okay. The soil's better now, softer, and good for different crops. That's what you see. So these are the farmers who are not devouring the natural resource base on which future food production depends. They're expanding it. They're building it, right? These are the hungry farmers who need to eat. So this is where they're showing us the way, and the question is, are policymakers listening? They're not listening in Iowa. I will tell you that they're not listening in Iowa. Climate change came heavy for farmers in Iowa and in other parts of the Corn Belt last year with heavy rains. Some farmers couldn't plant at all. Some farmers planted late. Some parts are still flooded, have been in, the Mississippi River has been overflooding its banks on and off all year because of the heavy rains. But the unsustainability goes much deeper of this industrial model of agriculture that looks very much, anybody from Iowa? Anybody from the Corn Belt? No. It's a blue crowd. It looks like you might imagine, in the sense that it's vast tracts in the growing season of corn and soybeans, interspersed with ethanol refineries and factory hog farms and the occasional windmill. That's Iowa. But the state's lost half its topsoil already, probably the richest soil in the world. And as somebody said, the best soil in the world used to be in Iowa. Now it's in Louisiana as it's flowed off the land and down the Mississippi River to the Delta in the Gulf of Mexico. 100-year floods happen every 25 years now. I call drought and flood the evil twins of climate change. They sound like opposites, but they're completely part and parcel of the same extreme weather phenomena that we're seeing. And NASA predicts much greater frequency of both intense storms and drought for the Midwest. There's nothing to hold the soil in place, so it washes away. And the nitrates and all the chemicals being put on the land also wash away and wash into the waterways, into the Raccoon River, into the Des Moines River, poisoning Des Moines' water supply. They have the largest denitrification water treatment plant in the world in Des Moines because of that. And they come very close to breaching the allowable levels of nitrates in the water. Wells, a third of the wells that have been measured have unhealthy levels of nitrates in them. That's nitrates from nitrogen fertilizer overapplied in unsustainable ways to these fields. The Jordan and and Dakota aquifers supplying fresh water to Iowa are being depleted. And I said, wait a minute, how's that true? Iowa doesn't have irrigated agriculture. It's rain-fed agriculture. They're not irrigating, so where's the water going? It's going to meat and ethanol. It takes 5 gallons of water a day to raise a hog in confinement. It takes 3 gallons of water to make a gallon of ethanol. And if you add up Iowa's production of both, that's about 40 billion gallons a year being drained from those aquifers. And at current growth rates, it's projected that those aquifers will indeed run dry. And of course, the water quality is abysmal. And that's been the subject of lawsuits brought by by that water facility that's trying to denitrify the water, saying, hey, farmers and companies are poisoning our water, and we can't keep this up. You should pay for it. You should clean up your water, and you should pay the costs. That lawsuit was actually thrown out. An intrepid local journalist, Art Cullen, uncovered that it was thrown out because a legal defense and campaign was mounted on behalf of those water districts accused of poisoning the water by the Agribusiness Association of Iowa with a secret fund, the first 2 contributors to which were Koch Industries and Monsanto. And that's, again, the beat goes on about who's calling the shots. But everywhere I went, and this includes Iowa, they're positive models for change. Matt Liebman is a remarkable Iowa State scientist who has been fighting these trends and this behemoth that some call the corn, soy, ethanol, pork industrial complex, which is Iowa's agriculture, trying to find ways to do things more sustainably. He has a remarkable experimental farm outside of Ames, where he took a traditional corn-soy farm. Corn and soy are usually grown in rotation, so farmers are growing some of both and flipping for soil quality purposes. That's the control group. In his experimental farm, he added 1 rotation of grass. Could be for animals, could be for other purposes. could be for cellulosic ethanol if that industry ever got moving, which it hasn't. But he wanted to study the environmental impacts of having that third rotation on that land. And what he found was that it reduced fertilizer use by 85%. It reduced herbicide use by 97%. It eliminated water pollution and runoff entirely. It reduced soil erosion and started to improve soil fertility instead of depleting it. And in the process, it maintained both the productivity and the profitability of the farm. And he shows me his farm, and I say, well, Matt, that's the win-win-win everybody's looking for, right? And he says, not exactly. I said, well, how many farmers are using that system now? And he says, almost none. His quote, I could not have devised a program that affected more of the state's agribusinesses. And it's kind of the moral of the story, because think about it. What's an 85% reduction in fertilizer use to a fertilizer company? Koch Industries is not happy about that. What's a 97% reduction in herbicide use to Monsanto? Not happy about that. If you take a little land out of corn and soy, the price for corn and soy will go up. That's the components of feed for the industrial hog farms in Iowa. What's Smithfield and Tyson going to say about seeing the cost of their feed go up a little bit? ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, biggest ethanol refiner, sees the cost of corn go up. Not going to happen. So they kind of exercise veto power over these sorts of policies. And that's what I saw everywhere I went, is that's the obstacle to change. I'll close by saying that all that said, there's enormous new energy to try and address these problems. And you've probably read about some of it. The Green New Deal is a big deal. And it's a big deal for agriculture, and it's a big deal in the Democratic presidential campaign. Nearly all the candidates have had to come out and speak to what they're going to do about unsustainable farming practices in Iowa, which both contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide from excessive fertilizer use, very fossil fuel intensive production processes, but also need to become more sustainable in their own and more resilient to climate change themselves. There are some impressive proposals in from those Democratic candidates about the things we could do to shift farm payments from encouraging overproduction of corn and soybeans, which is basically what we encourage now, to encouraging the sequestering of carbon and more sustainable practices. Exactly the kind of grassland management that Matt Liebman is talking about. It resonates with a lot of farmers because they're not winning, right? They see really low prices for their crops and really high prices for their inputs, and they're squeezed. So there's an argument to be made that farmers can be shown that this is a win for them if the system can be put in place to make incentives work to encourage a different kind of farming. As Matt said, another Iowa is possible. And as farmers all over Africa told me, another agriculture is possible. These in central Malawi, who are really, again, showing the way. In diversity is strength, that's where the answer lies. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. And I think we have 5 minutes for questions.
Ooh. Yeah.
I have to bring the mic.
Oh, you do?
1 second, please. We need the microphone for people online.
Okay, I'm sorry. When I hear this, and when I hear the process, when I go back to my economics 201 a few decades back, I learned that markets go to excess, which is invention, it's growth, it's new ideas, and then if they go too far, government pushes back, and they set regulations, they do this and that. And as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking of the income inequality issues that are in this country, where the markets have gone way too far, and government is not pushing back. And it would seem to me, from a political standpoint, we have to do something about government. Even these people have to do something. It's corrupt, and it's going after the corruption that I think needs to happen.
Well, it's a very good point, and it may not surprise you, but maybe it will, to learn that agribusiness spends around $130 million a year lobbying in Washington.
Yeah.
It's more than the defense industry spends. And if you take that kind of lobbying to a state level government like Iowa's, guess who wins? So it's the reason my colleague at Small Planet Institute, Francis Moore-Lepay, has moved from working on food and hunger issues to primarily working on democracy issues involved in getting money out of politics. Because these companies really are the main obstacles to change. And it doesn't mean they have no role in the future. It means that the extent of their economic and political influence is out of control right now. And it's very hard to make progress without addressing that. So thank you for that.
I have a question. What specific policies will you support to reduce hunger among poor farmers? And what is the role of scientists in helping along?
No, great. That's a great question. There's a lot of great work being done by scientists, ecologists, soil scientists, and others, working alongside these organizations that I worked with to help them, instead of going in and saying, your seeds stink, here are the seeds you should use, your soil's infertile, here's the fertilizer you should put on it. You go in and you say, what's your problem? What are your problems? What's working? What's not working? Let's analyze your soil. Nobody does soil analysis. National governments don't even do a soil analysis. They have no clue. Biggest problem in Zambia, where they're using way more fertilizer per area of land than Malawi does, and getting terrible results from it, is that everybody acknowledges that it's the wrong fertilizer mix for the type of soil that Zambia has. And it's because that's the commercial compound that's sold. And that's what they use. And nobody's going and analyzing, is this the right fertilizer for this soil? So scientists have a huge role to play. And if they can play that role in concert with farmers, it would be miraculous. Farmers would be shocked because nobody works with them that way. Someone asked me in an interview when I was doing a radio talk, somebody said, what innovation do you think shows the most promise? And I always feel a little trapped by innovation questions, because people are looking for the magic bullet invention. She wasn't really, but what I said was participatory plant breeding. Like, participatory plant breeding is where plant breeders go in and they don't say, here's the seed you need. They go in and say, hey, what are you using? Wow, that orange variety of corn seems great. Would more people around here use it if we could produce it more? Shall we propagate it to other communities? Can we improve it by careful seed selection so that we teach you how to pick the most productive seeds with the highest vitamin A content? That's participatory plant breeding, and that has been shown to work all over the world, not on the radar for most major development agencies. I have to throw the mic.
I know you said you were going to talk about India, but a quick question. Did you look at the zero-budget natural farming in India and what they're doing? It sounds similar to what some of these other
It's probably, if people don't know about it, it's a form of regenerative farming or agroecological farming that's zero budget means no external inputs, so that it's using all its own resources. It's being used. What's amazing about India is, because India is vast, it's being done on a massive scale in some states in India, and it shows huge promise. I did not look at that. This focus in India was on trade and the WTO complaint by the United States against India's National Food Security Program, which is promising to provide basic rations for 800 million Indians by buying crops from small-scale farmers and distributing it to the poor. And the U.S. has objected to it because You're all sitting down almost. It's an unfair subsidy to farmers. That's the US argument for why India should not be allowed to do that program. It's exactly what we did in the Great Depression. So the hypocrisy levels forced me to cover that one in the book.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it at this, but I think he can stay for a few more minutes. So if you want to talk to him, feel free to come forward. And let's thank him one more time.